Thank you all for being here, and thank you all on Zoom for joining us. So this is part of our graduate fellow lunchtime series. And so it's at the Social Justice Center. It's directed by Pablo Gilabat in the Philosophy Department, and also by Becky Accra in the Geography Planning and the Environment Department. And so basically the Social Justice Center is our mandate is to encourage social justice research. So we give out some bursaries to students working on important social justice issues. So today we will hear Gideon, his research project. So Gideon is a Ph.D. student in the Department of Geographic Planning and the Environment, as well as a graduate fellow at the center. So he will present his research on the politics of multi-stakeholder participation and inclusion in marginalized informal contexts. So he works at the intersection of urban planning, urban informality, and sustainable city development. And he focuses on sub-Saharan African region, more precisely on Ghana. So the talk will last for about, I would say, 45 minutes or so. And then it will be followed by a commentary by Norma Rantisi, who is also a professor in the Department of Geographic Planning and the Environment. And also, she is a co-editor of the online magazine Progressive City, Radical Alternatives. So maybe your comment would be like 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you like. Very short. And then after a little bit to the question here and the discussion with people on Zoom. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. So the camera is here, okay, and the speaker, the microphone is here, so it's best to talk on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming today to listen to my talk. I really appreciate it. Quite a turnout. It seems I'm a bit nervous, so please bear with me. I start to stammer. As Christian said, my name is Gideon Abagna, and I'm a second year PhD candidate in the Department of Geographic Planning and Environment. I'm supervised by the one and only and yes, she's going to give a comment on this. So before I start, of course, I have to thank the Social Justice Center for giving me this opportunity. Christian from Sabengi is not here today, and they are at least giving me a platform to share my research and the work I've been doing in the past few years. So I'm very grateful for that. So for my talk today, I have titled it Governing the Informal, from Violent Eradication or Eviction Policies to Participatory Slum Upgrading. Now, this title differs from what was already advertised, what Christian talked about, because I felt it necessary to take a step back to provide some research background, some foundational elements to the research I've been doing. Okay.
Does it work? It worked like 2 seconds ago.
Okay, all right. So I have divided this talk into 4 separate but interconnected parts. In the first part, I'll provide a research background, mainly from the global context. I'll discuss urban informality, which is the overarching conceptual theme of my PhD research. This concept might be familiar to some of you here, but I'll very quickly run through what it means and provide some examples of urban informal activity. The second part of my talk is dedicated to discussing a paper that I spent the first year of my PhD working on. This paper is currently at the last stage of review in the journal Habitat International. And as we know, the infamous reviewer 2 seems hell-bent on hogging it for as long as possible. Hopefully get published in the next few days. But this paper is a fundamental part of my PhD as I try to problematize the continual deployment of evictions and demolitions, what some people call bulldozer urbanism, towards low-income, marginalized elements in Ghana. In the third part of my talk, I'll dedicate it to discussing the participatory slum upgrading approach, and this is the substantive part of my PhD research project. And this is an approach that has been globally hailed and recognized as something of a silver bullet, or the best and effective way of rehabilitating informal communities. And in the last part of my talk, I'll focus on the next steps, what I plan to do in the coming weeks and months of my PhD work. Okay. Okay, so starting with the research background from a global context. First, Okay. So it is common knowledge following several propositions, such as the urban thesis, that the world is rapidly urbanizing. As of 2022, 57% of the world's urban population live in urban areas. This equates to over 4 billion people. From this map here, regions that are marked as red have a greater proportion of their population living in urban areas or cities. And as you can see, there are still several countries in Africa and South Asia that are still predominantly rural. Now, this is however expected to change by 2050. As estimates suggest that the urban population will reach about 68%. And the majority of this growth is expected to occur in Africa, with nearly a quarter of the world's urban population by 2050. So we expect about 1.3 billion people in urban areas by 2050. All in all, Africa is going to be a dominant player in the urbanization trajectory of the world. Now, while most developing countries like China are reaping the benefits of urbanization, it seems to rather disrupt urban functionality and stall socio-economic development in a lot of countries, especially in Africa. Now, urbanization is not accompanied by essential services in a lot of these global south countries, especially in Africa. And this has engendered what some people call an urban crisis. And so we have housing crisis, water crisis, sanitation crisis, and so on and so forth. And a fundamental cause of these crises can be laid at the feet of the neoliberal political economic project of states, right? That states now withdraw from social welfare programs that are trying to encourage market private-led policies. This very simple diagram here encapsulates the whole urbanization process and its attendant effects, especially in the African context. So due to urbanization, as I said, there is significant pressure on available services and opportunities. And this pressure became even more evident in the past few years due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And following this scenario, several households are faced with high cost of living, which further pushes them deeper into poverty. So what happens is that they are unable to access economic opportunities, they are unable to access amenities, and so they resort to what we call urban informality, which is, as I said, the overarching concept of my PhD work. But what is urban informality? Okay. All right, what is urban informality, which is what I'm going to discuss now. Now, for the most prominent scholars,
you can just let me up, because you can also just let me know I can do it.
Okay, all right. All the most prominent scholars in the discourse of informality and who are influential in my research engagements are Hernando de Soto, Alaina Roy, and John Turner. Some of you might have already heard these names in the past. But the first is Ipart, and on the far left, and he's often thought to be the progenitor of the concept of the informal sector. So he coined the term informal sector. And he conceptualized this in the 70s by studying one modern Ghanaian, the Frafras, which happens to be my ethnic group. And so I'm proud of it that my ethnic group was studied to conceptualize the informal sector. He traced how members of this ethnic group migrated to urban areas in southern Ghana, particularly Accra, which is the nation's capital, in search of economic opportunities. So he had argued that several of these migrants tend to be faced with the nexus of high living costs and low wages. And so denied success by the formal opportunity structure, these members of the urban South proletariat, as he calls them, seek informal means of increasing their income. And this historical narrative reveals how entrenched informality is in Ghana and how influential Ghana has been in the general theorizing of urban informality as a concept. The others have equally been immense contributors to conceptualizing informality. So Hernando de Soto, for instance, wrote about how we can solve poverty by converting the dead capital of the poor in informality to active assets. And Alaina Roy as well, who is an Indian scholar of international development, has also written extensively about the contemporary complexities of urban informality and how the state and elite groups actually engender such processes within the global south. The last is John Turner, to the far right, who is a British academic, and he has been influential in the field of housing. He wrote extensively about the aided self-help approach, which later got consolidated into the concept called the sites and services approach, allowing the urban world to construct houses from their own and self-help approach to housing. Now, despite the diversity and richness of literature on urban informality, a lot of people tend to say it's quite chaotic, it's fuzzy, it's confusing. But in general, when we talk about urban informality, we are referring to two main perspectives. One is the informal economy. It tends to encapsulates the informal sector and informal employment, and the other is informal housing. So you hear terms like informal settlements and slums. And so these are the two main dimensions or perspectives of urban in general. And when we talk about the informal economy, we are talking about two things: the informal sector, which is production and employment in unincorporated, small or unregistered enterprises, as well as informal employment, which is jobs or work without legal and social protection, informal enterprises, formal firms and households. So any job that doesn't have child and family benefits, unemployment benefits, disability pensions, so on and so forth, tend to fall under the umbrella of the informal economy. So just to give a few examples, which some of you might already know already. Okay, so one is street vending in Mexico City is an example of informal economic activity. We have a shop place in India, another form of informal economic activity. Next, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have jeepney public transportation in the Philippines. So another common and famous informal economic activity. We have garbage collectors. This is a very common informal economic activity across the global south. In Cairo, Egypt, they are called the Abagna, and they are quite well researched because of the efficient way in which they manage and recycle waste. So this is another informal economic activity. The last image here, sorry.
Let me do it. Back again?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So the last image here is that of central Accra, Ghana. And as you can see, there's a constellation of informal economic activities here. And so we have street hawkers that they carry something on their heads. Also, we have water, some sort of food provisions and all that. We have street vendors under the umbrella here. So it's another form of informal economic activity. A lot of them are mobile money operators. We can talk a bit about it later. We have informal transport, which is this one, which is the main mode of public transportation. A lot of cities in Ghana, they call them the truckers. So all this fall under the remit of the informal economy. Now, the other side of it, apart from the informal economy, as I said, is informal housing. And so here, this is actually the main site of my Ph.D. work, informal housing. And this pertains to slums, which are low-income communities or settlements that are created through micro-spatial development that fall outside of the remit of formal planning regulations, building standard regulations, land use maps, zoning laws, and so on and so forth. They are major house for migrants and refugees who come to the city and cannot afford housing in the regular rental market. According to several international organizations such as Gideon and Habitats, these communities fundamentally lack 5 key things. One is clean and potable water. We have good sanitation, durable housing, sufficient living space, and tenant security. So these 5 key things are the fundamental things that slums for informal communities lack. We can easily expand this list to include schools, hospitals, and so on and so forth. But these are the 5 key things these communities tend to lack. And slums also vary by size, age, character, and are variously known as favelas in Brazil, villas in Elias, sorry for my pronunciation, in Argentina, Barriadas in Peru, so on and so forth. Some people call them squatter settlements, shanty towns, nursery settlements, and so on. Now, the slum phenomenon is quite pervasive in the global south, with estimates suggesting that over 1 billion people live in such communities. That is, communities that lack these 5 key things I mentioned about. So over 1 billion people are in the states. This map here shows countries and their slum dweller populations. And again, as you can see, there's a significant concentration in Africa. So areas that have a deeper shade of red have a significant proportion of their population living in such communities that lack these key characteristics, these key amenities. Now, before moving on, it is important to make one clarification. Please, can you?
Of course, let me do it. Here?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The slum phenomenon, as I said, is quite pervasive. But before I move on, I want to clarify that the term slum is quite derogatory and denigrated because it tends to relegate the whole community to the background. So the word slum is a derogatory term. Several scholars have recommended us that we use the euphemism of informal settlement. But This is quite problematic, and today I opt to use the word slum over informal settlements for one crucial reason, because now there is an emergence of informal settlements by the rich or by the elite. And so here's an example of an informal settlement by upper income residents in the protected forest area of Bogota, Colombia. And so when we use informal settlements in place of slums, it tends to mask what we really intend to talk about, because we are talking directly about informal communities by a certain class, which is the urban poor. And so today I'm going to use slums, recognizing the derogatory nature of the word, but I only deploy it to refer to communities that are developed by a certain class, which is the urban poor. In some situations, I will mention the community's name directly rather than slums. And so this as well would allow me to circumvent this challenge or this issue. Now, given the scale and magnitude of the slum phenomenon, as I talked about 1 billion people live in the state, it is obvious that these communities require some planning and some governance, right? So generally, this is done in 3 main ways. And so I've displayed it here according to what I call the slum planning spectrum. On one end, the spectrum is the laissez-faire approach. On one end of the spectrum, the laissez-faire approach. And in this governance model, the communities are left alone with no direct action or policy. The logic behind this approach is that residents put themselves in such a situation, and it's their responsibility to get out of it on their own. In this scenario, communities engage in what is usually called do-it-yourself urbanism or pop-up urbanism. That is, residents come together, pool resources, and try to implement civic initiatives to resolve their own challenges because they are left alone by the state or by the government. The other extreme of the spectrum is a more violent and radical way of governing slums, which is evictions and demolitions, or what some people call bulldozer urbanism. This approach happens where the state moves into communities with the military and the police and destroys homes and properties of residents. In some situations, residents are pre-warned about the exercise, and so they are allowed some time to gather their belongings. But in many, many cases, the state does this spontaneously in order to reach the community, catch the community members of Ghana. Because I'll give an example in Ghana where we felt that when they warned them, they prepared and they're able to resist. So now they stop pre-warning, just go into communities and destroy them. Sometimes also alternative housing options are given to these households. And what happens is that they tend to give them housing options for the periphery of the city. And these households end up moving back to the city because they are not able to access the same economic opportunities that they have within the city center. A lot of international bodies have suggested that this approach to planning slums is a human rights violation, which is obvious. But the state still continually deploys this approach to plan or govern informal communities. And I'll talk a bit about this approach in my next section when I talk about the climate finding. All in all, these two approaches on both ends of the planning spectrum is deemed as inappropriate to dealing with the informal, urban informality phenomenon, the slum phenomenon. So ceteris paribus, which is one of my most favorite Latin phrases, the most appropriate and effective way to develop these communities is to upgrade them, and to upgrade them in a participatory and inclusive manner. So this is what you see in the middle, which is the participatory slum upgrading approach. So the processes and outcomes of implementing this approach are the empirical focus of my Ph.D. research project. Okay. Now, before I delve deeper into what I intend to interrogate in my Ph.D., I'll first problematize the continual deployment of eradication policies or eviction policies on informal communities for slum communities. And so this is where I'm going to focus on the paper I went from my first year of the PhD. So as I said, for the first year of my PhD, I was very curious as to why states continue to deploy violent planning instruments on these marginalized communities, despite their commitments to international accords and rules. And so these states are signed to international accords and rules. That's states that have to be inclusive, they have to be participatory, they have to be just, but they still continually deploy this radical form of planning, slum or urban poor communities. So more specifically, what I wanted to understand is how they seem to be getting away with little to no risks. Therefore, I worked on the paper titled Symbolic Legitimization of Evictions in Post-Colonial Identity, a review from Ghana's School for Now. This paper has about 2 rounds of review, as I said, and hopefully it can get published in the next few weeks. But more specifically, the two questions I was looking at in this paper was one, how are violent eviction policies legitimized and justified? And two, what outcomes do such policies engender in terms of their deployment? I grounded this paper in the post-colonial theory and the continued colonial and racist logics of rationality that underpin urban spatial ordering and organization in African cities. So several research has actually shown that colonial urban spatial policies in Africa insisted on a certain kind of order that essentially sought to remove the indigenous people and their activities out of sight, and in terms of planning, out of mind. So this was the colonial form of planning African cities. The policies were underpinned by a racist ideological consideration of Africans as unfit for civilized existence. Therefore, Africans were perceived as noisy, disorderly, vectors of disease, and prone to crime, and therefore must be spatially segregated and separated from the superior white race. So this was the colonial logic of planning African cities. The result of this urban spatial ordering was the alignment of strategic urban spaces to favor the needs of Europeans and a few African elites, undermining the majority of the indigenous population's chances to access urban spaces to improve their own standards of living. The case of apartheid South Africa is well known and well documented, this spatial planning model, the colonial era. And there is a plethora of evidence of so many African countries who went through this planning process. So for instance, in Sierra Leone, the colonial government labeled the native population as vectors of disease, including malaria and yellow fever, and displaced them from prime lands within the city. In colonial Gold Coast, which is today's Ghana, studies also show that the British used similar justifications to criminalize the indigenous people's access to prime urban lands. Invariably, Africans were evicted, and the best parts of the city were reserved for whites. What these experiences show overall is that colonial governments weaponized urban planning to align strategic urban spaces to support the needs of Europeans and a few African elites against the majority of the indigenous population's right to the sea. So this was the dominant form of planning then. In line with their modernization visions, most colonial African societies today have sought to revise their planning laws that they inherited from the colonial experience. And so Ghana, for instance, has developed so many normative and legislative frameworks. An example is the new Local Governance Act, which was implemented in 2016. And the idea for implementing this legislative instrument was that they wanted to develop a decentralized structure of urban planning within our city. That was supposed to allow for sustainable and inclusive spatial planning process. However, the attitudes and practices of Ghanaian politicians and urban planning professionals still reflect and are embedded in the violent and exclusionary colonial logic and rationalities of urban spatial organization, as I just mentioned. So even though they have changed the planning instruments, the logics and rationalities still remain. That is, trying to evict a certain group or a certain class of urbanites. So as with their colonial counterparts, post-colonial Ghanaian central and local government officials frequently invoke aesthetic, hygienic, and immoral behavior concerns as justifications to displace urban residents. Such aggressive interventions often result in the normal social and individual sufferance, which is homeless. Example is homelessness. So when they deploy this, a lot of people tend to go homeless. And nonetheless, research shows that interventions appear to enjoy public support, which is quite shocking and surprising. A lot of media reports in Ghana today celebrate these public officials as poster children of effective leadership. And so those who employ this violent and radical way of planning slums tend to be hailed as effective leaders. They are strong and they are able to follow through with their work in a sense. And in this paper, my main concern was to uncover how, in fact, we are still able to elicit public support in the contemporary period, even though we know obviously that it is causing so much harm and good. And so this is what my paper aimed to focus on. And I decided to focus on Ofadama, which is Ghana's largest slum settlement, as a case study. And just to give you some context about Ofadama, it is located just 1 kilometer from Accra Central. So Accra Central is 1 kilometer away. And obviously, based on this distance, it is deeply embedded within the central business district of the capital city. And as shown in both maps, the community is bordered by the recently destroyed e-waste site. So this was the former e-waste site, and it was the largest e-waste dump site in the world, actually. And it has been destroyed in 2021 and 2021. It is also bordered by the Odo River, which from this zoomed out map you can see. And in terms of population, this community currently houses about 100,000 people, so it's quite a large community. And land size, in terms of land size as well, is about 31 hectares. For several decades, there have been so many attempts to destroy and bury this community from capital city. And this dates back actually to the colonial era, so it started way before now. So for instance, in 1914, the British colonial government sought to split the community for railway projects. A similar attempt was made in 1920 to construct a harbour. And in both situations, residents were able to resist and stop this eviction or clearance process. In 1961, however, the government issued what is called a certificate of title. And so they decided to allocate the land all around the lagoon, the river that I showed you, for a project called the Kole Lagoon Development Project. So they wanted to implement a project. And they were able to convince the traditional leaders within the community that this project is going to have some form of national interest. And so they agreed with the decision of the government. However, this project stalled since 1961, stalled because of so many coups and limited investment and funding. But again, in the early 2000s, they kickstarted again because they were able to access funding from so many different sources. And this kickstarted actually the first major eviction notice, which was sent to the residents in 28th May of 2002. This project or this eviction process failed again as well, because the residents were able to draw on the support of international organizations such as the SDI, so the Shack or Slum Dwellers International. There was also an organization called the Center for Public Interest Law that offers free legal representation to these informal settlements. And so they aligned themselves with these organizations and were able to resist the first eviction notice that they received in 2002. Other evictions again were attempted in 2004 and 2009, all failed as well. They were able to resist, which is quite positive. But in 2015, the city authorities had grown wary of the many failed eviction attempts. And so they observed that the notices allow residents to adequately prepare and push back. And so what they did is that they decided to destroy the community and force evict the residents without any prior warnings. And this was in 2015. So a team of heavily armed military and other law enforcement officials were unleashed into the community to obliterate about 2,000 dwellings along the banks of the Kole Lagoon on 20th June 2015. So in 2015, the government rolled into the community and destroyed so many houses. And this has continued ever since. More recently, in July 2021, there has been a lot of demolitions and evictions under what the mayor calls the Let's Make Accra Work. They have a campaign that calls the term Let's Make Accra Work, which is quite ironic. But how these policies in general are justified and legitimized in the eyes of the general public is something that seems to have received very limited scholarly attention. I think this is what I tried to explore in my paper. And to do this analysis, so to do this analysis, I drew on a framework which is called the Van Leeuwen Symbolic Legitimation Framework. This framework has been used to analyze several topics such as judicial decision-making processes, political speeches, and ethnic matters. And more recently, it was used to analyze Egypt's capital city relocation, or what they call the new administrative capital. So for this paper, I adopted a critical discourse analysis by drawing secondary data and literature. I will very briefly discuss one or two findings from applying this framework within the context of both Abagna and Accra. Okay, so I observed two forms of legitimization or justification under the theme of authorization from the framework I showed before. So first, the first form of justification I noticed was the deployment of the military, the police, and other law enforcement officials that have some level of justifiable command and vested authority as order keepers. And so you can see from the picture on the left, the deployment of the military. And this image, of course, shows this community looks like kind of a war zone because they wanted to kind of obliterate the whole community. I actually have a video of this exercise, and I think it's going to be difficult because then we have to watch, so maybe I'm going to leave it at that. If someone wants to watch it on their own, can watch it, but it's quite horrific. Also, another form of justification that I found from the literature was from mayors, ministers, and sometimes the president actually legitimizing and endorsing such exercises. So in general, in the eyes of the public, when these officials get involved and say, oh, this is necessary, it is important for us to evict them because probably they cause the whole city harm, it gains some form of legitimacy because they have the vested authority. And the other form of legitimization again that I noticed is what is called expert authorization. So as I said, in 2002, before the first major eviction attempt, the government conducted an environmental and social impact assessment, an ESIA project. And the idea of the project was to identify the impacts of the community members on the river that I showed you, the lagoon, and as well as on the soil. And the report concluded that households were destroying the lagoon and the soil quality. So that was the conclusion, the general conclusion from that ESIA report. And a senior consultant that was part of this process urged the government to declare Abagna a national disaster site and suggested that if immediate steps were not taken to resettle the people or to evict them from the area, the project would be a complete waste of resources. But the findings of this ESIA report was contentious and problematic. Why? Because I observed an interesting twist. There were two other reports that were published. One by CORE, which is the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, and another by an independent group, the Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Scala in Finland. And so these two groups did their independent studies as well. And the findings were contrary to the government-funded ESIA study. So while the government said that these community members were totally destroying the lagoon, the river, and the soil quality, these two reports presented contrary findings to that. And so in general, it seemed as if the ESIA report or the process that was developed by the government was some sort of political measure to justify and justify their action of destroying the community. Because in those two reports, the conclusion was that some rehabilitation or some upgrading could minimize the effects that community members had on these resources. So for the sake of time, I'm going to the next form of justification that I noticed that I'll just highlight very briefly is what is called moral evaluation. And so this involves a structured and demonizing language of labeling the Abagna settlement as Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know if anyone knows the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but this image here is of newspaper headlines that summarizes the story I'm talking about. So this name has a very strong implication because in the Old Testament of the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah were two ancient cities near the Dead Sea with significant prostitution, sodomy, death, evil, and vice. Some analysts have suggested that this framing of Abagna was deliberately pushed forward by the government to garner public support and to justify the need to remove the settlement. From tacit experience by living in the country, I observed that this strategy seems to have worked, as both the media and general public sided with the rightful need to evict outlaws and replace God was ultimately destroyed. And so naming it as Sodom and Gomorrah gave it some legitimacy that God is going to destroy this community. So why don't we do it now? Because there's so much vice going on in that community. So therefore, moral values and buzzwords of bad, unsustainable, filthy, derelict, dangerous, national security threat were used to characterize the neighborhood and subsequently to justify the need to evict community members or the residents. So all in all, this paper reveals to me that as with their colonial predecessors, as I explained, not only do post-colonial Ghanaian officials often sermon aesthetic, hygienic, and other discourses to justify repressive spatial measures, but they also resist alternative analysis and potential solutions to displacement intervention, like the reports I showed you, the ESI state. And these raise questions regarding why government experts and officials favor displacing poor urban communities over other means of addressing the environmental and other social challenges that they associate with these communities. So why do they stick to displacement over finding rehabilitative measures for these communities? Now, as I said, this community is just 1 kilometer from central Accra. And so logic states that the lands in which are located on is prime urban lands, right? And so the residents' current use of this space as a source of employment, low-cost housing, it conflicts with the national and municipal government's vision of allocating it for exclusively high-end production and consumption because of its prime location. So evictions are used to spin spaces so that official vision of enhancing the city's image and promoting it for luxurious and high-class projects are not compromised by the visible presence of marginalized groups because of the allocation. So state-led displacement or attempts to displace this community and other slums in Ghana reflect a certain exclusionary and discriminatory spatial development that aligns urban investment in favor of the needs of a few minority elites. So what in general, just to conclude from this paper, post-colonial urban policies, so post-colonial here with a hyphen in between, seem to have remained post-colonial, that is together. And what I mean by this is that they have retained all the colonial trappings and paraphernalia of discriminating and dominating the poor majority. So it's the same logic and rationality that has been moved forward into the post-colonial era. So it appears the only difference is that colonial officials likely sought to use the policies to achieve racial outcomes, while the post-colonial ones are pushing for exclusive high-end private capital-driven consumption and production, which is typified by the current neoliberal project. So as I mentioned not too long ago, evictions and bulldozer urbanism engenders a humanitarian crisis, as I said. But there have been clarion calls by academics, international organizations to move away from this form of governing and planning and reform because of the endless challenges it brings. And the most appropriate and the solution that they have put forward is to go for what is called in situ slum upgrading, which has been crystallized as the participatory slum upgrading approach. And this is the approach my Ph.D. work focuses. This approach has been supported by several international accords. So these are just a few examples. One is the Cities Without Slums Action Plan by the Cities Alliance. We have the MDGs, particularly MDG 7, which ended in 2015. We have the SDGs as well, SDG 11, targets 11.1, 11.3, talk about participatory slum upgrading approach as the best way to develop these communities. And lastly, specific to the African context, we have the Agenda 2063, which also highlights and emphasizes participatory slum upgrading as the best way for us to develop informal communities. Okay, so what then is participatory slum upgrading? So in general, it's a rights-based approach focused on incrementally improving the physical structure of slums first. So the housing condition, the infrastructure needs these communities. It also involves some economic policies, some economic strategies, so job creation, as well as governance changes within the structure of the slum. At the center of this approach are the principles of participation and individual initiative. So these are the two key principles of this approach. And generally, there are three types of participatory slum upgrading. One is upgrading driven by individual or household investment, upgrading driven by community or neighborhood investment, or upgrading driven by external programs. Now, upgrading driven by external programs seems to have received a lot of significant scholarly attention because it's mainly pushed forward by the UN Habitat. And UN Habitat, just to give you the full meaning, is the United Nations Human Services Program, which was established in 1977 from a UN conference, which was held here in Canada in Vancouver in 1976. And so UN Habitat has kind of pushed forward the participatory slum upgrading approach because they implement a lot of programs and projects in so many countries across the world. So they developed what is called a participatory slum upgrading program. That is the UN Habitat. So even though participatory slum upgrading had been in years before, in 2008, they decided to commission a full program that was dedicated to implementing projects across the world. And this started in partnership between the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of states and the European Commission. The program aimed to enhance stakeholders' ability to understand the multidimensional nature of the slum challenge and identify and implement appropriate and sustainable responses to these communities. Participatory slum upgrading programs effectively put slums on urban agendas and encourages the necessary policy changes, budget allocations, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. So currently, this program is operational in 160 cities in 38 countries, providing enabling frameworks for at least 2 million slum dwellers. And so this is still a limited number compared to the 1 billion or 1 billion I told you in terms of estimates. So there's still need for improvement. Now, Ghana was one of the first countries selected for the implementation of this program, specifically Gamashi, and the two oldest neighborhoods in the city of Accra, which is Jamestown and Ashwatown. So this was the community selected for this project. And the selection process of these communities is one that is quite problematic because there was a lot of political interference in this process. But a major reason why this community was given the nod for this project is because it's identified as a legal and indigenous slum in Ghana. According to the government, this slum is legal and indigenous. And so they gave them some kind of priority in terms of the program. Now, because of the history of this formation, Gamashi and very few slums in Ghana are seen as legal, and thus enjoy municipal services such as water delivery, electricity from the national grid, amongst others. So very few slums in Ghana actually get water from municipal authorities or electricity from the main grid, but Gamashi is one of those that, according to the government, is legal, and so they can offer them these services. Now, this is in complete contrast to Old Fadama that I talked about a few minutes ago. Old Fadama is seen as completely in the eyes of the authorities, and that's why they constantly try to evict and demolish them. Gamashi is locally referred to as Gan or Old Accra, and it covers an area of almost 100 hectares along Ghana's southwest coast. Estimates today put it that the population of the community is over 150,000, much larger in terms of informal estimation. As in other parts of Ghana, the chiefs are referred to as manche, and they hold land in trust for their communities. And so lands within a community is held by chiefs or customary authorities. And so it's not individual. It's either by the school or by family. There is no individual ownership of land within this community. Gamashi is also well known for its vibrant public spaces, street art, murals, graffiti, and so on and so forth. And as you can see on the picture on the left, it is also known for a lot of historical buildings that date back to pre-colonial and colonial times. These buildings represent moments of historical significance, not only for the community, but Ghana and the world, leading UNESCO and several other institutions to designate these buildings as World Heritage Sites. So an example is the James Fort Prison, which has been dedicated as a World Heritage Site. So in general, these resources within the community allow them to attract tourists from time to time, which is a form of income generation. So despite a lot of studies from this approach and this program, what I have found missing a lot from the analysis is that there is very few interrogation of the participatory process of these so-called participatory and inclusive projects. And so these projects are tagged as participatory and inclusive from the outside, but very few interrogation has gone into how these participatory processes apply on ground in a sense. And so I asked a very simple and broad question in my Ph.D. project. How participatory are participatory slum upgrading projects? Very simple and quite broad. So while many of these participatory programs tend to portray inclusive principles in their plans and reports, more research still needs to be done on how they translate in practice. Today, when urban practitioners and policy experts talk about participation and inclusion, they tend to present it as a linear, simple, and clean process that could easily be practicalized. Yet research shows that it is complex and quite tricky to operationalize, compounded even in fast-changing and diverse contexts, such as low-income slum communities. These communities are riddled with unequal power dynamics, involving local elites, traditional or customary actors, political patrons, and different marginalized social groups. All these stakeholders have diverse identities, needs, aspirations, and priorities. How are all these consolidated and included in the decision-making process is the question I asked. My objective is therefore to create a theory-practice gap by assessing the realities of these programs on the ground. In other words, I aim to move towards an all-inclusive participatory slum upgrading agenda. The operative word here I'm using is all, as I advocate to leave no one behind in the quest to rehabilitate these marginalized urban communities. My PhD work is also grounded in the right to the city theory, developed originally by Henry Lefebvre. So Lefebvre in his Right to the City, offers a radical and more open-ended vision of urban politics, and urban politics of the inhabitants. The rights advocated by Henry Lefebvre are not tied to national citizenship, and so someone's right to the city is not tied to their nationality, but to all those who inhabit the city. So as far as you inhabit the city, you have some sort of right. And Lefebvre calls them citizens instead of citizens. The right to the city involves two principal rights of urban inhabitants: the right to participation and the right to appropriation. That is the right to use and produce urban space so that it meets the needs of inhabitants. So a couple of questions I ask therefore is that, are these participatory slum upgrading programs actually practicalizing these rights? What forms of participation are employed? Are there indigenous or localized strategies of involvement adopted? Or are these participatory slum upgrading programs just masking their true intention? Henry Lefebvre laments in his earlier writings in the 70s that participation is often invoked in city politics, but rarely practiced seriously. And so this is an angle that I want to approach in my Ph.D. project, that this participation and inclusive principles that tend to be developed in their reports and found to be actually practicalized on the ground, what are the challenges that are faced. So the strategy of my Ph.D. involves three stages or steps. The first, it involved the problematization of violent slum eviction policies, which I've already done, and I explained in the paper we talked about. The second, which is ongoing, involves a conventional literature review and assessment to ascertain some drawbacks or challenges and prospects of implementing the participatory slum upgrading approach, focusing on how the idea of participation is practicalized. I'll talk very briefly about this process I'm going through. So one of the projects that I have reviewed in the past few weeks is the Villa 20 project in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And this project has been lauded in the literature for its participatory process. The project is being implemented by the Housing Institute of the City of Buenos Aires. It started in 2015 with authorities approaching the neighborhood leaders to establish a dialogue, define intervention objectives, and involve the relevant actors in the decision-making process. Following a situational analysis, representatives of the slum identified the major problems to be addressed. And one crucial problem that they identified was there was a lack of participatory definition of the adjudication criteria of new housing. And so when they constructed new housing, there was very limited participation into who gets what and when in terms of the listing process. Throughout 2016, the Housing Institute worked on helping the community to organize and consolidate what is called the Participatory Community Management Board, which is aggregation of anything. And other strategies that they developed in this project was an all-inclusive voting system. So they developed a very inclusive voting system. And to define projects on each block, there is formal and secret voting in which each family can cast a vote. And by this means, the urban project or the block is validated and legitimate. So they have very unique and interesting ways in which they involved several groups. So in general, by analyzing and synthesizing this project and so many other projects, which I'm going to do in the next couple of weeks, I hope to draw lessons for Ghana, as well as to establish what lessons Ghana might offer to the broader scholarship. I will also start to understand how vulnerable groups are included in the decision-making process and what roles different power dynamics play in the process and how to circumvent these power dynamics during participatory processes that are employed. So just to end, what's next for me? So the last step after reviewing these global projects will be the empirical analysis of what is happening in Ghana, which is my project location. I'll start this in a few months' time. Hopefully in May or June. I'll be traveling back to Ghana for a site visit and to conduct some preliminary data collection. I also hope to intern with an organization closer to community members. I'm in the process of finalizing the paperwork for this. And two organizations that I have in mind are People's Dialogue and the Ghana Development Agency. In the field, I plan to conduct very short and informal discussions with different social groups in slums, so women, ethnic minorities, youth, disabled, amongst others, to document their varying aspirations and priorities regarding slum upgrading. Also to be discussed with these groups is the extent to which their varied aspirations and needs are being captured in the current participatory slum upgrading projects, how they participated in the design, implementation, and post-implementation phases of the projects, and how the process overall can be made more inclusive for all. While in the field as well, I also finalized my Ph.D. proposal, which I intend to defend in the summer. And more immediately, in 2 weeks' time, I'll be attending the AAG conference in Denver to present my research in a session dedicated to exploring informalities on various scales and themes. Hopefully, I can get feedback and input from other international scholars that will help me fine-tune some of these ideas I've shared with you. So that's it for me today on my blog.
So if you want to take like 2 minutes to go refresh your coffee, take some sweets, I'll set us up for the discussion for Norma's commentaries.
Yeah, I think it's almost because I.
We have a lot of oh, you will grab some for them. I have some bags that you can use later.
Oh, I think that this. There's a.
Yeah, because it's not.
That's my fourth year. I'm like ready to go.
Yeah.
I got that online version.
There was a bit more people, but they had to go. So yeah, we now have people online, and I already have a question from them. It was nice. It's so interesting.
I'll come. Leave at 1:30, so I'd love to leave as disruptive as possible.
There's no more. Natural is on the first floor. We're in the lounge. I'm like, oh. Yeah. Are you going? Are you coming back for the question? Okay. Oh, I tried. Oh, it's fine.
It's just like, I'm so tired. Like,
Well, how are they?
no, but I will be because of 30. That was very beautiful. Really beautiful. Like, you're always.
I tried to make it as practical as possible.
I appreciate it, right? To like start with the like foundation.
Yeah.
Like it's I'm like, yeah, people.
What I'm doing, I did it and
Because geography is always. I remember last year I was teaching segregated kind of go to this, right? Like, because that's one of the things they've done, and I was trying to like.
I think what they do is
And that's a charge, so they reach that target, therefore they will go back pieces. But of course, like they're eradicating them through things like this, right?
Yeah, exactly. They're real. It doesn't be serious.
Since there was the e-waste site up by yours, right? So
Yeah. To get it credit our minds, we don't get English science, social factors, that they don't then. The project was, I think this is one of the possibilities.
soil itself, like these.
So if it's.
Water, right? Like that's a water that they.
Yeah.
That's, you know,
That's business station, yeah.
It's hard. Yeah. The things
Like the.
it's-
So now I'm having.
Oh, for sure. You got rid of the site, but
Yeah,
the legacy is for me. I'll let you settle. Right,
Sorry that didn't work. I saw that the battery was dead. Instead of ringing, so it's died. Okay, it's okay. So we'll hear a commentary from Norma Rantisi, whom I presented earlier, so I will do it again. And you can take as long as you want, and after that, we'll have a collective discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to hear from others, because Abagna and I have been in conversation for a while now about many of these things. So I guess first, I just want to thank you for your presentation. Even though we have talked at length about a lot of these issues, it's really helpful to have this presentation that consolidates both the kind of context for which the ideas have evolved and what the current kind of state of your thinking is and where you plan to go. And I just wanted to also mention that Abagna Gideon is really been publishing for the last several years on the theme of urban informality, and is really, in my mind, at the cutting edge of a lot of the research that's going on in relation to urban informality in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. And in particular, I think it's going to be making very valuable contributions in regards to the Ghanaian context. I do have a couple of thoughts / questions, not necessarily for answering now, but for maybe consideration on the longer term horizon, which actually were prompted by your presentation. So I had a couple other questions beforehand, but then others emerged as I was hearing you talk today. And so I just wanted to start with that. Firstly, I feel like the focus on the participatory nature of upgrading initiatives is really critical because of the fact that there's been a lot of co-optation of participatory processes, co-optation in particular by states that often have predefined agendas and are already establishing the terms in which participation occurs. And in many cases, participation then becomes more of a passive response than the active construction of priorities and agenda items. And so it's for this reason that a focus, I think, on participatory slum upgrading in this case, which affects those that are often the most marginalized in relation to participation in political decision-making processes, is quite central. So in regards to participation, two thoughts that came to mind was Firstly, that it's often defined or assumed to take the form of formal consultations or meetings. It can be at the community scale, but it's often this idea of, and I think the visual that you had about the community board meeting was really indicative of this, the kind of setting or context in which it occurs. So I think one of the potential valuable contributions that the research could make is also reflecting on non-participation and why. And so kind of moving beyond the space of the actual meeting to thinking about who's not present and who's not able to voice and why. Would it be, for instance, things like, disinterest in what's being discussed, who's convening the meetings and how, a lack of time. Because a lot of people are probably, as you were showing, if there's often the incidence of informal employment within informal settlement or slums. And so a lot of, time is spent trying to make ends meet. Are there potentially procedural reasons? Or maybe even, again, more substantive reasons such as the agenda and the priorities listed. And how open-ended is it? So thinking about also non-participation as, in a way, in itself, a commentary on participation. Another thought is maybe thinking about alternative forms of participation. And I'll explain what I mean by that. One of the really interesting things that came out of the study of Old Fatima was the forms of everyday resistance that a lot of the residents were engaged in. They were actually trying to build their own kind of forms of economic livelihoods and support networks and so forth. This is a kind of form of participation, of appropriating space for one's own kind of needs. So it raises, I think, interesting questions from a planning perspective about what lessons can be learned from everyday resistance and how it can inform this process. I think a second thing that came up in your talk that I think is really important is the question of scale. And we see a lot of tensions in relation to this question of at what scale should planning happen? And and that has implications also for thinking of who the so-called stakeholders could be. One of the interesting lessons, I think, again, from the Old Fatima case that I think is really informative for your ongoing research is that there was, in a way, a downloading of responsibility for the conditions that is particularly the environmental conditions in Old Fatima, a downloading of that onto the residents themselves. And the idea that the residents weren't able to engage in more so-called sustainable practices, would result in the blaming and the pathologization of the residents. What this does is to shift responsibility from government and also to shift responsibility as being or resting in comprehensive planning approaches, even though most of the drivers of environmental degradation tend to exceed or spill over any localized settlement. So the idea, that it's individuals that are both at fault and or responsible when a lot of the issues are actually regional issues, I think, is a critical question in regards to responsibility. Also, there was an interesting, in terms of the map that you showed, the proximity of Old Fatima to other parts of Accra. And so that too points to the kind of interconnectedness of the fate of Old Fatima to other parts, and really calls, I think, for a regional potential lens, at least in part, in terms of planning implications. The and again, I guess the final point in regards to the planning, question of planning, is that there's not only lessons that could be learned from everyday localized resistance, but again, another lesson from Old Fatima was the role of other organizations like SDI, the Slum Dwellers International, which was providing a lot of support and resources and exchange of information. That I think you called in other works and drawing on other scholars as globalization from below, which I really like that kind of framing. But it also, I would argue, is planning itself, even though it's not been often presented as such. It's a way planning can be practiced. So I think the Old Fatima case really presents a lot of interesting lessons about reflecting on how planning, could operate, how a more participatory and anti-form based on how contextualized the processes under right. So I think I'll leave comments at that.
Thank you, Norma. So maybe you would like to reply to some of Norma's commentary before I read one of the questions that we have online?
Yes, thank you, Norma, for the comments. I have written a lot.
Well, we're going to talk more about those things too.
But I think one of the points you raised, which I think is very interesting, is the multiple forms of participation, because I think from my engagement with the literature, people tend to present participation as a homogeneous process, right? It's just one thing. But there are several forms of participation. So for instance, Sherry Einstein developed what is called the ladders of participation. And so there are several levels, with the basic level of participation of just giving someone information or not taking anything back, and still conceptualize participation. So all these forms of participation probably in this so-called participatory processes are not quite as participatory as we think from the outside. And that's why I'm saying my project should look at realities in the ground, practicalizing some of these things to try to understand that what they actually say they want to engage in is what's going on in the ground. So yes, I agree. There could be non-participatory processes being employed that are still tagged as participation. So that is one important thing in my thinking as well. And I think the other thing I would like to also just briefly highlight is the question about scale and who are the so-called stakeholders of this process, because I've also noticed that a lot of the slum communities, because my master's project is on slums, I developed 2 theses in slums, so I've engaged with slum communities about them. I've noticed that there are a lot of political patrons that are within these communities that benefit from the state of slums as they are now. And so the logic of us upgrading and redeveloping it goes counter to their motives and intentions of allowing slums to still degrade, because as they degrade, that is when they make their profit, that's when they make their money in terms of providing services to these households. And so they don't want these communities to be upgraded. And so there are several stakeholders and forces that are going on within the community that go counter to our logic of upgrading and trying to redevelop them. And so all these multiple and diverse issues going on are things that, in our process of upgrading, that we have to circumvent, and how it is going on as well. I need to understand which from the outside is hard to do. And so these are some of the issues that I think come up when I get to the field and I start to talk to people.
Just wanted to let you know that someone on Zoom, Alex, said that this was an excellent point while you were talking about this.
So yes, I think I'll end it there. If anyone else has questions, comments, I'm open to any and all comments. Please do ask now.
Do you want to jump in right
Oh,
now?
yeah. Sorry for being late. Days are my teaching days and sometimes I doesn't end when it's supposed to end. I also went to the old building 12th floor because I'm completely confused about which day it is, what role am I in this event. So actually, my PhD dissertation was about participatory natural resource management. So it's kind of speaking to the same topic from a very different perspective and also kind of echoing what Norma said. It was a way, I mean, it kind of probably one of the most centralized bureaucratic states in the world, Turkey, doing something kind of pilot projects of participatory natural resource management was quite like, okay, the agenda is predefined and the pilot projects were never enlarged to actual management mechanisms afterwards. And my dissertation was supposed to be about how women were excluded from these decision-making processes. But then it became about non-participation because none of these mechanisms actually worked. So I guess my first point is that the kind of the different forms of participation, the ladder of participation, the non-participation, the silences, the location of the meetings, the timing of the meetings, they're all very subtle ways in which these mechanisms do not work and very much power-laden. And there is probably more literature in natural resource management and participatory exclusions than urban management, because there's been kind of this win-win solutions, community-based natural resource management that was rolled out, especially with Eleanor Ostrom's work too, that kind of became like the new neoliberal environmental, but democratic kind of mainstream. And it was especially kind of rolled out in a way in countries like India, where there was already a strong tradition of communities managing their own forests, for instance, with like public-private partnerships. So the literature coming from there is quite more developed, like since mid-1990s. So you might want to look at that a little bit. At least in my work, what I find is not only non-participation, but also expectations of being taken into account that really shapes how much people went or like voice their opinions in the meeting. So especially in a historical context like yours, where like there's been so much happened already, and then now there's like this new kind of old wine in new bottles kind of thing. People won't go there like actually thinking like this is gonna work. So how they navigate and like kind of those positions could be important, and like how they challenge. So even in the kind of in those kind of constructed spaces of participation, they might find ways to kind of to resist and like to take. I mean, I've seen women actually kind of, because the meetings were in coffee houses, which are traditionally masculine spaces. And during when women were supposed to be grazing like animals, kind of just invading coffee houses and like taking the like, so there are different ways, kind of very different ways of resistance. Is one, like that's one kind of literature maybe you might want to look at. And then another one is the entire kind of post-politics literature also kind of emerged from this participatory governance. I don't want to say bullshit, but bullshit, especially at different scales of EU and EU integration. So, and that kind of speaks to, and it's something that you already mentioned, that ways of legitimation, right? So sometimes participation, as Norma was also kind of hinting at, works as a way of legitimizing something that's already kind of on the agenda, but also kind of, I think the lesson from the post-political literature is that it uses to kind of, rather than bringing antagonism to the table where like people kind of articulate their positions to and like to politics, it kind of diffuses antagonism through like bureaucratic mechanisms and like time-consuming meetings and like consensus and like kindness and whatnot. So I think that's something too, like to kind of diffuse the, so it could be like this dialectical process of like resistance, but like diffusion and neutralization of kind of conflicts. And so like there's so many ways like lens to read the participation that it's like, it's really very, I feel like, productive lens to look at some of the things that you're already doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I'll try to find your thesis.
It's too long, don't worry. We can talk about it if you want sometime, like just I can talk more about like what went wrong there. So, but also if you really want to read it, it's 400 pages. Oh wow. I mean, when you try to write this thesis in an economics department, you kind of want to, you have to make it look like economics while like actually writing what you want to write. So it's like a double feature.
So we have a message, a question online by Hussein Al-Bazaz. What has been the most common role taken by residents in the participatory slum upgrading initiatives, the one in Old Fadama?
Okay, so just to clarify, Old Fadama, Participatory Slum Upgrading Program there is internally done. So it's not supported by the government, because the staff as illegal. So as I said, they engage in what is called the pop-up mechanism on doing self-reliance. So in every project, they come together, pool resources on their own, and initiate these initiatives. So for them, they solve their issues on their own. And the one common way in which this is done is by developing what is called socio groups. So it's a savings group kind of initiative. And so a lot of women, and it is solely women-based, that they develop these savings groups together, then they pool resources over time, and they try to probably construct a house for one person and goes to the cycle. And so these projects are done group by group basis. And this is contrary to Gamashi, which is from UN Habitat, and it's a different way of upgrading, because that is top down a lot of the time, because they just tell them what to do. Ofadama is quite a unique case in Ghana. Very few slum communities are able to successfully resist. As I told you, that they are resistant with the help of international organizations. And it doesn't happen often. And so their case is quite unique and not, I can't generalize to all slums, it's a unique case, but it's quite interesting because of the processes going on there. So all in all, Participatory Slum Upgrading in Ofadama is community-based, done by residents and not with any help from the government.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Sorry, I also arrived so late, so I missed the first part of your presentation, so I don't know if you talked about it, but I am working also in housing projects, social housing projects in Colombia, but in the 60s, so my research is really like historical. But it's also, we also have these slum eradication programs in those moments, and a lot of help, self-help programs, things like that. So one thing I was, or I'm like trying to see is how the state is very different inside, you know, like those different organizations that in the state that participate in all of these slum or housing programs, that is the city, but also the nation, but also banks, like from the state, but also the public services like aqueducts, electric enterprises. So it's very different. All those have to like organize to do a project in one place. So are you working like with that idea, like how is different also the form or the way the state those very different instances of like they are like approaching the population of this slum project? that's one. But when I was listening to you talking about these savings groups and these ways of financing those programs, in this project you are looking at step down, is this like a credit program, or how is the like the investments like managed? So it's like credit for people, or is like everything's paid by the state, or how do they manage those things? And also because what I'm seeing in Colombia is that a lot of people didn't want to like participate in those programs, in those slum eradication programs, or like buy a house because it implies to get into a credit, long-term credit relationship. So for people it was very difficult to pay, and people really prefer to stay in the slum and like live in a very long, like have another kind of housing solution for their problems. So yeah, that was like something that we discovered reading about this, but it was very like interesting because sometimes we overlook those financial or economic relationships that also appear from doing this kind of slum project.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the points and critical. I think I'll start with the issue of credit and financing, which is very, very important, in my opinion, because yes, I have noticed that from reading some program reports that they offer a lot of credit to a lot of households, but the issues that they are trying to navigate now is the collateral part of it. So a lot of them do not have the legal rights to a lot of properties they claim to have, so they don't have the documentation for it. And so it has become so difficult to offer this credit, but they are still going the formal route. But from my perspective, there is a lot of informal means of offering credit that I think are much more efficient, and the SUSU is one of them. But these formal programs do not want to align themselves with these informal ways of doing things. So they still go the formal route. So in Gamashi, what I know, my very little reading of some of the program reports, is that they are still trying to go the formal credit route, which I think is going to be problematic in the long run, because a lot of these households, the economic activities they engage in are not regular income sources, and so they are paid irregularly. So they are not able to pay this credit back within a certain amount of time. So yes, credit and finance is an issue, which I think I'll come across when I start the analysis. But formally, what they do is that they go to the banks and credit institutions to give out loans to households. Now, I have heard that there is a new system being implemented in Kenya called the Hustler Fund, which is a bit different and quite unique. So I'll try to dig deeper into their system of developing credit, but it looks like it is not the formal route. So I want to see later read. I just heard about it a few days back. I'll later read and see how that credit system works. But credit and finance, I agree, is an important part of upgrading projects. And the other thing that you mentioned about utility companies and the multiple agencies and institutions involved, I think that is a very important point, because from the outset, when I thought of this project, immediately what came to mind is these programs, first of all, come from an international scale. And so the institutions and organizations involved are so much that I think participation is going to be led, in a sense, because a lot of these institutions and organizations have their own interests, and the power that they have is so different from those on the ground. And so it's going to be so difficult to tell me that you are developing a participatory process with these many stakeholders, and you are still going to let the voices of those on the ground to be elevated in a way. And so my initial thinking about this project was the number of companies and institutions involved. And yes, I'm thinking about that, and hopefully I'll see how, I don't know if there are ways in which they are navigating this. I'll try to find out. These are two very important ones I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Are there any questions here and in the room? If not, I think you have a fan online. Akin Dishi, do you want me to read it, Gideon, or do you prefer reading it yourself?
No, I am very bad. So I
You
can.
want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, Gideon. Thanks for the talk. I know your work well, so glad to see how even more cohesive it is coming together. Can you explain if there is any distinction or conflict between the conceptualization of legality and formality in the legitimation process? What a word. Okay. So in Lagos, Nigeria, for instance, the government adopt similar eviction strategies, and one logic to justify these displacement actions was to tag the informal settlements as illegal. So I wonder if illegality in your study context is always equal to informality.
Okay, that's a very good question, I think. And yes, indeed, illegality is one way in which evictions are legitimized, as I said. Old Fadama, actually, they try to name it extra legal and not use illegal because I think it's also a political concept, but they call Old Fadama an extra legal slum. And yes, it is a way in which they tag these settlements for eviction because if they are located on lands that are illegal, the government in a way or the state in a way has the right to remove them from those lands if the lands are public lands or private lands. So yes, illegality is one way, but in general, I wouldn't equate informality with illegality because I think informality is a state construct. And as I explained, there are a lot of informal resettlements that are not called informal in the eyes of the law. And so in general, informality and illegality are two, there's a thin line between them because there are some forms of informality by a certain group of people that are not called informal by the states or by urban planning institutions, while informality by a certain class of people are called informal. So informality and legality are not directly the same, I should say.
That's something that I'm on a working group with Jamie. We're focusing on Latin America. We both have a lot of experience in Colombia. And this conceptualization of informality is something that we've talked about a lot, because usually when people talk about informality, what comes to mind is no rules. And in informal contexts, as you know, there are many rules, and you sort of discover that as you interact with the people on the ground. And so I was thinking about that as you were giving your talk, and because I think really what's central to your presentation is urban planning, because I'm not sure if you consider the actions, both individual and collectively speaking, of the people who live in Old Fatima as upgrading, because really they're just trying to find ways to satisfy their daily needs. So they're just in a daily process of upgrading, if you will, not necessarily upgrading in terms of making this a better neighborhood yet, although I'm sure in terms of their aspirations, that would be one of the questions. But I think that when you are on the ground and you speak to the people, there's sometimes in our research in Cartagena, for example, where they call them barrios de invasión. So there's encroachment on these natural ecosystems because it's close to the city, it's close to their work. And then the city wants to remove the residents because they claim that it's damaging the ecosystems. But in that decision-making process, because they're rational decisions, the people move there collectively and they operate under their own rules because they have a vision of what they want to do in those spaces. And there's both like the individual sort of rationale where it's a pragmatic choice. I have to live here because it's close to my work and there's no other place for me to go. And I'm going to build a house with, found material. But then there are collective actions as well, where people are getting together. And so you can look at this encroachment as strategies to sort of begin a dialogue with the state, with the local government. So it's both, there's a pragmatic reason for the actions, but there's also a strategic reason for the action because it forces the state to pay attention to them. And in the same area, there are real estate developments, also building on the border of these ecosystems that are completely sanctioned by the state. And the ones that are more informal, quote unquote, are not sanctioned at all. So there's this ambivalent attitude from the government towards who is occupying the space. And so they're getting together collectively so that they have more of a negotiating power with the state. And those types of activities, collectively speaking, individually speaking, but also collectively speaking, as Norma was saying, you'll find out more about that once you're on the ground. But it's really, really important. I don't know, I'm not familiar with Ghana, but in Colombia, Jamie was mentioning this financing, because a lot of the financing is done by people who have money, but it's sometimes illegal groups or mafia organizations that live in the neighborhoods too. They control these neighborhoods. So they have in Colombia the presta diario. They lend money, like a lump sum, let's say $200 to fix the roof of your house, but you have to pay them back on a daily basis. And if you don't, well, there's serious consequences. So who, you know, what are those financing structures? Yeah, you mentioned it in your presentation, there are some dynamics within those neighborhoods, but all of that information, I think, is going to make your research richer and more informative for the people interested in these concepts of informality and urban upgrading and urban.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Alex wants to ask a question. Yeah, Alex, you can unmute it. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for having me here, and I appreciate the extra effort it takes to do hybrid, so thank you. And Gideon, first, thank you for your talk, and congrats on your recent prize from the Fonds de Recherche Québec. Looks like it was very well deserved. Great presentation. I'm curious about the role of kind of education systems in these communities, specifically the community you're focused on. You mentioned some of the institutions, but I wonder just, are the schools, or how schools, especially primary, I'm thinking primary level schooling for children, like how are they involved or not, or is it kind of just not present in the community? I just wanted to let you speak about that if that's possible.
Thank you so much for the question. So regarding schools, in Old Padama, there are a lot of public schools. That's because of the centralization of community as legal. So we still offer them these resources, public schools. Old Padama, sorry, I said Kamashi, they have public schools. Old Padama, no, there are no public schools. And again, regards to schools, I have talked to one or two principals. It is also private led. And so individuals develop their own private schools on their own, try to educate. The standards of these schools are very poor. There was some part of my master's thesis that was it's very bad. Some of them stand in the classroom, no desk, but they still try to offer education, primary education, middle school. And what happens is that they try as much as possible after the middle school level to try to find, other schools outside the community. And so a lot of community members tend to stay within the communities to school, to the middle school level, then they move out. In Gamashi, it's totally different because the government is trying to, through this participatory slum upgrading and so many other programs and projects, trying to provide them with all these amenities, which is part of the upgrading process. So schools, I think, yes, it's very important in a sense, because of course we need to educate the children within these communities. But Old Padama is one that I don't think in the foreseeable future is going to receive this level of support until something drastically change in the political sphere, I think.
Right on, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Akeem. You can unmute yourself and ask your question if you want.
Thank you. It's actually not a question. I was going to follow up on Alex's question that there is an organization called Bridge International Academies that seem to have provided a solution to primary school education in informal settlements. I know they operate a lot across Africa and maybe beyond. I know they are in Lagos. I shared a link on in the chat box. You can take a look. And I know one solution they were providing for low-income families in Lagos, Nigeria, and across Nigeria as a whole was to actually charge tuition on daily basis. And tuition that is as low as maybe 10 cents equivalence. And so families who make their income from hands to mouth, like we say in Lagos, they work in the informal sector, so they only feed with what they make from their daily struggles. So those families are unable to put together $500 or $200 in a year or to pay for tuition. So they would rather pay 50 cents every day. They would rather pay 25 cents every week. And that was one solution that Bridge International Academies provided. I think they might have changed names recently or changed strategies. They also have their own shortcomings, but it seemed to be one of the most innovative education solution in informal context, especially targeted at low income families that I have seen in the last decade.
Great. Thank you for that. I'll take a look at this. Thank you. Any more questions?
I have one practical.
Sorry?
Are you going to the AUG in Denver, or are you participating here in Montreal? That's good. There is also a hub in Montreal that the professor organizes.
Oh, okay. They have a session on informalities from multiple scales and teams and other centers. So you will also see the perspectives of other scholars from other things.
Nice.
There are any more questions or comments?
One, but it's very stupid, sorry. When we were talking, I was wondering, what about the like political participation? Are they like registered voter? Do they have political power? Yeah. Okay, so they have like physical address and they are registered and stuff like that?
They don't have addresses.
That's
But
what,
they are-
yeah, that's what I was wondering.
No, they don't have formal addresses because they are illegal, but they do vote. So.
How
yeah.
did that, does that work?
Oh.
Sorry.
I didn't know voting. I don't know about the global north, whether voting is associated to address system one. But a lot of people, when they migrate, they still have the original addresses, right? So they can still vote, not vote for, let's say, a municipal mayor or something, but they still travel back home. So,
Okay, so they do have some kind of political power,
yes.
but not as a community situated in a certain locality, so it's less, they have
In the
less.
case of Gamashi,
Okay.
yes, because I said it's legal, so they have the property address system and everything. Both for them and because in the eyes, they are not supposed to be there. So for them, they don't have that political power. But they still do build some political power in a sense, because when it gets to election days, like when you need tags to, let's say, man certain police stations, they go to those communities to try to get the youth out there. So they still have some political power. But in terms of voting directly for whoever the city mayor is and all that.
In general, what is the health of the democracy?
In Ghana,
Yeah,
it's relatively stable, I would
Okay.
say. Of course, we have issues like a lot of global south countries, but election-wise, there's very few.
What do you mean by health of the?
I was wondering, like, do people like really vote? Is it, are regular people able to run for office, stuff like
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But of course, there's the issues of violence and stuff that happens almost everywhere. But yes, relatively, I think we are one of the most democratic countries in West Africa. I think Hakeem will validate. Yes, so.
Hakeem has another question. He has the hand raised.
No, I think he did.
No, I didn't, I forgot to actually lower the hand, sorry.
No problem.
So Gideon, did you call me in on?
I said you can validate that Ghana is one of the most democratic countries.
Yeah, yes, in West Africa, Ghana is a shining star of democracy. Yes, Nigeria. I think Nigeria's Achilles heel. By the way, I'm from Nigeria, so Gideon is from Ghana. We are both neighboring countries in West Africa on the coast of Atlantic, and so we are also rivals in soccer, football. So yes, Ghana has a pretty healthy democracy, but not without its problem. Nigeria's problem, there's a lot of it, a very diverse population, over 200 million, compared to Ghana's less than 20 million, I believe. So our problem is 10 times, if not more, of Ghana. So that's one major challenge. And then Nigeria is actually in the middle of a general election right now, a very, very, tense one. So, yeah.
Thank you. One question? Comment?
Sorry that I was so late.
Same office, I'll share my research.
I've read your articles. Thank you so much for presenting your work, and Normal, thank you so much for making time. And it's been very stimulating, and I'll be in Denver too.
Oh, you will.
Yeah, I have a fight to pick with eco-modernist socialists.
I'm not going this year.
Well, I didn't want to go, but like I don't know, I have to defend like people somehow there, so I will go, but I'll try to make it to your session if I can. And good luck with AAG. I hope it gives, I mean, it provides the kind of network and the perspective that is like hard to get at other kind of points and stages of a research. So it's really good to see students present their work at this stage. I think it's really kind of a lot to take in point. So it's good luck with everything. Thank you all for coming, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
I forgot to ask you that. Was it okay if I recorded the session? Yeah, I did, but I forgot to ask you before it was started. So I was like, okay. Do you want me to? Can I put it on our? I'm happy.
Thank you so much.
I gotta go.
Please grab some food for your home.
I gotta run to my son. Okay, the student, I'm meeting a student, so.
You seem so busy. Are you okay?
Very tired.
So it was my first time using this room.
The what?
Using this room, it was my first time. It's pretty good. I like it. It's okay. Yeah. It's not that big, but
it's like. Nice, it's like, it gives like an intimate feeling of.
not recording.